A quiet woman stepped into the airport like any other traveler, just a laptop bag, a calm smile, and a boarding pass. But what the officer didn't know was this: she wasn't just here to fly. She was here to watch. And when the wrong man decided to humiliate her in public, he didn't realize who she really was. Just 7 minutes later, he was being escorted off the job. What followed shook the entire airport system and exposed a truth too many had ignored. Stay with me. This is one story you won't forget. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this hits home, hit that subscribe button for more stories that matter. It started like any ordinary day, but it didn't end that way. It began, as it often does in America, not with a shout, but with a glance. A long, flat look cast across a crowded room, loaded with the quiet menace of someone who believes the uniform he wears makes him more than a man. At Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, just past the security checkpoint where the metal detectors hum like restrained accusations, stood Officer Daryl Lane, a tall man, white, with a badge too polished and a posture too proud. He wasn't a federal agent. No, Daryl worked for a private firm contracted to support the TSA, but he wore his authority the way some men wear old injuries, loud, bitter, and unprovoked. And when he saw Naomi Clark step forward in that line, something in his gut clenched, not from fear, but from that quiet, ugly hunger for control that festers in men who never question the shape of their own power. Naomi was calm. That was the problem. She was black and she was calm. A dangerous combination in a country where people have often confused black composure for defiance. She didn't shuffle. She didn't apologize for existing. She wore dignity the way some women wear perfume, light, but unmistakable. She dressed plainly, jeans, a blouse, hair braided neatly back. But nothing in her appearance explained the quiet threat Daryl felt rise inside him. It wasn't about what she wore. It was about what she didn't fear. She handed her ID to the TSA agent without incident. That should have been the end. But Daryl leaned in, clearing his throat like a man preparing to declare ownership over a space that was never his to begin with. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but insistent. "Step aside for additional screening." The TSA agent blinked. There was nothing unusual in her documents, no red flags. But the agent looked away. They'd seen Daryl operate before, and they'd learned to let the storm pass. Easier that way. Safer, too. Naomi tilted her head slightly, a faint crease forming between her brows. "Is there a specific reason?" she asked. Daryl gave a shrug that only white men in certain uniforms seemed perfect, a gesture both dismissive and authoritative. "Just doing my job, ma'am." "Random checks." "Random," Naomi echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. But behind her eyes was a storm she didn't show. She stepped aside. It's in these small rituals, the word random, the shrug, the refusal to name the reason, that racism in America continues to breathe. It no longer needs to call itself by its name. It lives in policies without oversight, in the silence of bystanders, in the slumped shoulders of those who have been through this theater too many times to protest. The female agent patted her down, apologetic eyes meeting Naomi's. She whispered, "I'm sorry," as if that changed anything. Naomi said nothing. She wasn't here to confront. Not yet. Daryl watched with arms folded, eyes narrow, a smirk playing on his lips like a boy pulling wings from a fly. He wasn't concerned about security. He was measuring his power, flexing it, not for safety, but for spectacle. And what he didn't know, what would, in time, undo him, was that Naomi Clark was not just a traveler. She was an undercover federal inspector for the TSA. She was here to investigate him. But in this first chapter, Naomi said nothing. She let the ritual unfold. Because she understood something every older Black American learns. The first time they see you, they don't see you. They see an idea, a threat, a problem to be handled. They do not see humans. Not yet. So she waited. Waited while he rifled through her bag with performative suspicion, touching her books, her makeup, her underwear like a man entitled to inspect dignity. She waited while passengers stared and some looked away. She waited as the line behind her thickened with curiosity, disapproval, and shame, not his shame, but hers, as if this public questioning made her suspect. She walked away, eventually, released by a nod and a cold, "You're good." But she knew this was only the beginning. Daryl had no idea that the calm woman he tried to humiliate was the one person in that terminal with the power to hold him accountable. And perhaps that's the oldest ritual of all, a system so comfortable in its own impunity that it fails to recognize the day it puts itself on trial. Every society, whether it admits it or not, runs on two sets of laws, those etched in paper and those written in silence. The former is printed in black ink and claimed to be equal. The latter is whispered through generations and enforced with a stare, a tone, a delay, a humiliation too small to protest and too consistent to ignore. Naomi Clark understood both. She had spent years memorizing the first, but it was the second, the unspoken, the invisible, that she had come to expose. 2 hours after Daryl Lane had first pulled her aside, Naomi sat near gate C-23, notebook open in her lap, pen moving in slow, deliberate strokes. She wasn't scribbling. She was remembering, cataloging, documenting. Because when a person's pain is dismissed as an anecdote, you learn to build a case made of details no one can deny. Around her, the airport moved as it always did. Announcements echoed over loudspeakers, children fidgeted near power outlets, a man in a worn jacket slept hunched over his carry-on. Life went on, indifferent. And that, too, was part of the problem. The machinery of the world kept turning, while dignity, black dignity, was chipped away piece by piece, without witnesses who knew what they were looking at. Naomi had seen Officer Lane's kind before. Always just shy of outright brutality. Always just within the gray space where plausible deniability lived. His power wasn't in the badge, it was in the comfort he felt wielding it against certain people. She saw it in the way he paused just a second longer when a black man stepped forward. How his voice grew sharper, more performative when addressing a Muslim woman. How he leaned into his posture when a Spanish-speaking family appeared unsure of what to do. He didn't shout. He didn't shove. He simply managed the line in such a way that those who looked like him passed through like wind, and those who didn't moved like stone. That was the unspoken law he enforced. Naomi flipped a page in her notebook and wrote, targeting through delay. Performance of suspicion. Leaning into discomfort without naming it. Just then, a new scene unfolded before her, a young black boy, maybe 16, fumbling with his duffel at the checkpoint. His hands trembled slightly. His ID looked real. His boarding pass is valid. But Lane stepped in again. Son, step over here. No explanation. No alarm. The boy's eyes darted nervously, and Naomi felt the twist in her own stomach, the ache of familiarity. That boy wasn't being stopped for what he did. He was being stopped for who they thought he might become. And that, in America, is a crime in itself. The mother who raised Naomi had once told her, "They don't need bars to build a prison for your pride." Sometimes all it takes is the right man with the right smirk and a long enough line to humiliate you in. Naomi reached into her bag and tapped the small audio recorder, ensuring it was still running. Her job was to observe, but it was getting harder by the moment not to act. Still, she waited. Because her job wasn't to interrupt the scene, it was to build a mirror big enough that no one could look away. Daryl Lane held the boy's ID to the light, turned it in, squinted. He tapped it once against the podium like a gavel. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Detroit," the boy muttered. Lane cocked his head. "Family there?" "Yes, sir." "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, sir." "Why?" That question. Not where, not when. But why? Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, her pen motionless. In that one word, everything about Lane's view of blackness came spilling out. Why would a young black boy travel alone unless something suspicious was afoot? What reason could he possibly have to move freely? The boy said nothing for a second too long. That pause was all Lane needed. Secondary check, he muttered, calling over another officer. And that was how it happened. No outburst. No public shame. Just a slow, surgical slicing of confidence. The other officer was a woman. She looked weary of the routine, but complied. The boy followed, glancing over his shoulder once, at no one in particular. But Naomi felt the weight of that glance land squarely in her chest. This chapter of her assignment wasn't about confrontation. It was about accumulation of evidence of patterns of pain. And the pattern was growing clearer. She finished her note. He doesn't fear consequence. That's what makes him dangerous. He knows just how much he can do before someone complains, and just how little will be done when they do. As she rose from her seat and walked toward another terminal, Naomi knew the time for observation was nearing its end. The next confrontation would have to be deliberate. But for now, she let the injustice hang in the air like thick humidity, unseen, but undeniable. Because in America, racism doesn't always arrive with sirens. Sometimes it waits quietly at the gate, checking your boarding pass with a smile that never reaches the eyes. A uniform, like a flag, is only as honorable as the heart that wears it. But too often in America, the uniform does not sanctify the man, it shields him. It grants him license to project his fear, his suspicion, his prejudice into the lives of strangers, all beneath the banner of security. And for Naomi Clark, still pacing the polished floors of Hartsfield-Jackson, it was becoming clear. This wasn't just about one man named Lane, it was about what Lane represented. By the third day of her assignment, Naomi had documented 6 separate interactions in which Lane delayed, humiliated, or otherwise mistreated passengers of color. Each time the pattern was subtle but unrelenting. A delay here. A snide comment there. An extra pat-down. A long stare that said, "I don't trust what I see." But the question, Naomi knew, wasn't what he saw, it was what he chose to see. At 10:07 that morning, an Indian-American woman approached the checkpoint. Mid-30s. Glasses. Neatly dressed. Her English was slightly accented, but fluent. Lane asked her 3 times to repeat her destination, as if the word Sacramento required federal verification. He pursed his lips when she offered her ticket, as though it had insulted him personally. When she looked down in discomfort, he smiled. A small, crooked thing. Victory by way of condescension. Naomi stood back, in the flow of travelers, silent, seething. She had once believed, naively perhaps, that data alone would be enough. Those facts, cold, measured, unarguable, could illuminate the shadows. But what she was gathering wasn't just data anymore. It was evidence of a sickness. The sickness of small, systemic humiliations, drip by drip, that wear away a person's dignity until they no longer expect fairness, only less harm. Later that same afternoon, the final blow came. It was a black father and his daughter. The man wore a blazer, jeans, and clean white sneakers. The girl, no older than 9, clutched a pink backpack with a unicorn stitched on the front. They laughed as they approached the checkpoint. Naomi noticed, she always noticed, the way black families carried themselves in spaces like this. The shoulders are a little straighter. The smile is a little wider. A quiet insistence that said, "We belong here too." But Lane didn't see any of that. He saw a black man, and something about that laughter offended him. "Sir," Lane said flatly, "I'm going to need you to step aside." The father blinked. "Is there a problem?" Lane tilted his head. "It's just a procedure." "But I have a pre-check," the man replied calmly. "I've already been cleared." Lane didn't answer. He simply stared. Then said, louder, "Do I need to ask again?" Naomi felt the shift. She felt it in the way the daughter's hand gripped tighter around her father's, in the way nearby passengers looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak. Lane wasn't just delaying this man, He was performing dominance. He was reminding everyone who was in control. The father hesitated, then nodded. Of course. As they stepped aside, Naomi's heart broke a little, not for the indignity, but for the girl who had just seen what her father couldn't shield her from, the way the world would sometimes make him small. And that was the worst part of all. Lane didn't need a reason. Because in the quiet codes of America, suspicion is not an accusation when it's wrapped in a badge. And blackness is not innocent when it walks through a metal detector. Naomi clenched her fists. She wanted to act, to step forward, to say, enough. But she knew the trap of rage. She had learned, over the years, that black anger is always seen as aggression, nerve pain. Instead, she turned away. Not out of cowardice, but calculation. There would be a reckoning, but not here. Not yet. Later that night, Naomi sat in her hotel room, the city lights flickering across the windows, and she recorded the day's events. Not just what happened, but how it felt. The tightening of the chest. The ache in her ribs when she watched a little girl's smile fade. The exhaustion of being asked, again and again, to prove what she already knew. She ended the recording with a single sentence. They don't see us, they see what they've been taught to fear. And that, in a land that calls itself free, is perhaps the most dangerous lie of all. It begins with a whisper. Not the kind you hear with your ears, but the kind that lives in the pit of your stomach. A whisper that says, be quiet. Don't make it worse. A whisper that generations of black folks have learned to obey, not because they are weak, but because they know survival often depends on silence. Naomi Clark had heard that whisper since she was a child. She heard it the first time her brother was pulled over for looking suspicious while walking home from school. She heard it when her mother told her, always carry your ID, baby, just in case. And now, as an undercover federal inspector walking through the same airport where uniformed men wielded suspicion like a weapon, she heard it louder than ever. But she also knew something else. The whisper may keep you safe, but it never makes you free. It was Thursday morning when the stakes shifted. The complaint she reviewed that day wasn't from a traveler, it was from another TSA agent. A young Latina officer named Isabel who had been on the job for only 7 months. Her report was brief, hesitant in tone, but devastating in implication. I've noticed Officer Lane tends to choose passengers based on how they look or speak, especially people who look Muslim or black. I tried to say something once. He said if I kept talking like that, I wouldn't last the year. Naomi read it 3 times. Isabel's words weren't angry. They were frightened. And that, Naomi thought, was the real horror. Not just that a man like Lane could get away with what he did, but that the people around him had learned to fear truth more than they feared injustice. That afternoon, Naomi returned to the checkpoint, not in disguise, not hidden behind hats or coats. She walked through as herself. Confidence, black, and be aware. Lane saw her. She saw the flicker in his eyes. Recognition. But also calculation. She wasn't dressed for business that day. She wore jeans and a hoodie, just like the man he'd harassed the week before. And when she reached the podium, Lane's voice came sharper than before. Step aside, ma'am. Random screening. Naomi said nothing. She didn't ask why. She didn't protest. She simply stepped aside, opened her bag, and watched. Lane searched her laptop, asked her where she was going. Why was she traveling? If she had a return plan. The questions weren't standard, they were strategic. Each one designed to remind her she was being watched, judged, doubted. She answered quietly, knowing every word was being recorded. And still, he wasn't done. As the line grew longer and travelers grew restless, Lane pulled her jacket off the tray and gave it one final pat down, even though it had already passed inspection. You never know what people hide, he muttered. Naomi didn't flinch. She turned to look at the others in line. She saw a man shake his head, a woman roll her eyes. But no one said a word. Because everyone knows the rule. Don't argue at the airport. Don't challenge the man with the badge. Obedience, even when humiliating, is expected. And there it was again, the whisper. But Naomi, recording all of it, wasn't interested in whispering anymore. That night, she met with Isabel. The young agent looked over her shoulder 3 times before sitting down in the cafe. She spoke in hushed tones, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her paper cup. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said. "But he gets away with too much." Naomi listened. "He makes jokes when nobody's around," Isabel continued. "About those people, you know. He calls extra screenings target practice." Naomi felt something cold settle inside her. "And when I said something, he said I was being emotional. That I didn't understand how real threats work." Naomi reached across the table and touched Isabel's hand. "You did the right thing," she said. "But it won't matter," Isabel replied, her voice shaking. "People protect their own." Naomi sat back. She thought about that sentence. People protect their own. And in America, too often, that means white men protecting white men from accountability, from discomfort, from consequences. Naomi knew what came next would be harder. She'd seen enough, recorded enough, but now she needed something more. A witness from inside. A truth-teller who refused to be silenced. Isabel looked down, afraid. And Naomi leaned in closer. "You're not alone anymore," she said. "You don't have to whisper. Not today. There is a peculiar violence in being doubted. Not the kind that draws blood or leaves bruises, but a quieter cruelty, a steady erosion of dignity done in the name of order, protocol, or just doing my job. This is the kind of violence Black folk have known for generations, not because they have invited it, but because America has never fully asked itself why it needs to suspect them in the first place." Naomi Clark was no stranger to this violence, but she was about to bring it into the light. It was late Friday morning when she returned to the checkpoint, not to be screened, not undercover, but in full professional attire. Her TSA credentials tucked in her briefcase. Her voice rehearsed. Her mind is ready. Lane was at his usual post. The same bored scowl, the same leather gloves he didn't need but wore anyway, like a cowboy with no cause but plenty of suspicion. Naomi didn't approach him first. She waited. And she watched. An older Black woman shuffled through the line with a small floral suitcase and too many layers of clothes. The kind of traveler who made everyone else in line silently groan, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she looked like she didn't quite know the system. The kind of woman who still carried paper boarding passes printed at home. The kind who still said "excuse me" when the bins confused her. Lane zeroed in on her. "Ma'am, take your shoes off." "All of them," he barked, as if she hadn't heard the rule 100 times. She fumbled. "I said shoes." "Now." Naomi stepped forward, slowly. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flash a badge, didn't offer credentials. She simply stood beside the woman and said softly, "Do you need help, ma'am?" The older woman looked up, startled, then nodded. Lane's eyes narrowed. "Step back. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Naomi said, her voice even, steady. People around them stopped pretending to scroll their phones. Travelers perked up. Silence gathered. Lane stepped forward, lowering his voice, but not his tone. "Are you trying to interfere with a federal screening?" "No," Naomi said, meeting his glare with quiet defiance. "I'm watching it." That was all. But it was enough. Lane's jaw tightened. His chest puffed. He turned to the TSA agent next to him, Isabel. She met Naomi's eyes briefly. Then, without saying a word, she stepped in and gently guided the older woman to a nearby bench to help her remove her shoes. Lane barked again. "This isn't a community meeting. It's security. You don't just insert yourself." Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out her identification. The badge caught the light. "My name is Naomi Clark," she said, calm as scripture. "I'm an inspector with the Office of Civil Rights and Liberties, and I've been watching you, Officer Lane, very closely." The silence broke. Lane frozen. The young TSA agent next to him stopped scanning IDs. Someone in line let out a quiet gasp. Naomi continued, her tone sharper now. I've documented 3 incidents this week alone of you escalating routine screenings against travelers of color. I've reviewed hours of surveillance footage. I've spoken with your colleagues and I've spoken with your victims. You may call it vigilance. I call it abuse of authority. And it ends today. Lane's face turned crimson. You're twisting this. I was doing my job. People like you make it impossible to. No, Naomi cut in, voice rising just enough to remind him, and everyone listening, that she was not afraid. People like you make airports unsafe. Not because of who you stop, but because of why you stop them. You've confused suspicion with power. You've confused fear with safety. And the problem is, nobody above you ever thought to question it. Lane stepped back. He looked for support. There was none. Isabel stepped forward. I'll write the incident report, she said, softly but firmly. Naomi nodded. Then she turned, addressing the passengers still frozen in line. You don't need to be afraid of asking why, she said. You don't need to stay silent when something feels wrong. Your safety doesn't have to come at the cost of someone else's dignity. The line began to move again, tentatively at first, then more fluidly. But something had changed. In that moment, in that space where silence usually lived, Naomi had placed a stone in the water, and the ripples were already beginning. The hardest part of fighting a system isn't the resistance. It's the silence. It's the look in the supervisor's eyes when they say, we'll look into it, and you know they won't. It's the way coworkers nod in agreement when the offender is out of earshot, but later, at the meeting table, they lose their courage like loose change in the cushions of power. And worst of all, it's how the victims, the ones humiliated, detained, searched, questioned, begin to question themselves, wondering if the offense was real, or if they've just grown too sensitive from carrying history on their backs. Naomi Clark walked through the corridors of Hartsfield-Jackson with that silence trailing behind her like smoke from a slow-burning fire. She had filed her report. She had submitted her evidence. And for a brief, flickering moment, she thought the weight of truth might tip the balance. But days passed. Then a week. The only sound she heard was her own echo in the halls. Lane was still on the job. Still barking orders. Still looking like a shadow over every traveler whose face didn't match the majority on the billboard advertisements lining the terminal. Naomi had been in the game long enough to know that power rarely folds from a single push. It retreats. It whispers. It reorganizes. And then it waits. So she didn't back down. She came back. But this time, she didn't come alone. At her side walked Mr. Elijah Douglas, retired FBI liaison, son of a Pullman porter and a man who'd stared down more men like Lane than Lane could count. His voice was slow, deliberate, like thunder from a distant storm. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to witness. They stood by the glass railing above the TSA checkpoint and watched. A young black man in his 20s was stopped again. His backpack searched. His shoes were rechecked. Lane made a show of inspecting a box of protein bars like they were sticks of dynamite. See it? Naomi asked. I see it, Elijah said. And then, not a minute later, an older Asian woman was pulled aside. Her granddaughter tried to explain. She doesn't speak much English, but Lane waved her off and began gesturing aggressively, as if louder hand movements could bridge a language barrier his mind had no patience for. Naomi's fingers tapped the railing. You feel it, she asked. Elijah didn't answer. He didn't have to. They went to the terminal's operations office and requested a meeting with the airport's director of passenger experience. A man with a polished smile and the kind of empty apologies you could roll off a factory belt. We've reviewed Officer Lane's file, he said. There's nothing egregious. No bruises. Naomi asked. No lawsuits. The man looked startled. That's what you're waiting for, isn't it? Elijah added, voice low. For someone to sue before you act. For a body to hit the floor. Because of this harassment? This humiliation? It's too quiet to trouble you. The director straightened in his chair. I assure you, we take every complaint seriously. Naomi leaned forward, her voice like smoke curling under a door. Tell me, sir, how many complaints have you taken seriously from people who look like me? He had no answer, because none had ever reached his desk. They died in the inboxes of underpaid assistants. They were filtered into surveys, filed under miscellaneous feedback. Misconduct hid behind numbers, behind procedures, behind the myth that the system always corrects itself. It doesn't. It resists. Because injustice doesn't sleep. It naps in policy. It whispers in meetings. It waits for the world to stop watching. Naomi and Elijah left that meeting not with a promise, but with a mission. They returned to the floor, to the people. They spoke with passengers who had been stopped. Not all wanted to talk. Some did. An Indian engineer pulled aside for a random check 5 times in 2 months. A Muslim woman was forced to remove her hijab in public. A Jamaican grandmother made to empty her Tupperware, 1 spoonful at a time. Each story wasn't a flare, but together they were on fire. That night, Naomi sat in her hotel room writing. Not just emails, but statements, drafts, letters to regional TSA offices, civil rights commissions, news outlets. She wasn't looking for fame. She was looking for light. Because power prefers the dark. But people like Naomi, they bring the morning. There comes a moment in every country's reckoning when the stage is set, the actors are summoned, and the curtain rises not for a performance, but for a trial of the nation's conscience. This hearing, called to investigate Lane's conduct, was never just about flight protocol. It was about power. It was about the weight of uniforms and the lightness of certain people's grievances when held up against the gravity of others' lived experience. It was about what we choose to excuse and whom we are too afraid to hold accountable. The room itself was gray and sterile. No drama. No flags. Just nameplates, long tables, and bottled water that would never be opened. Naomi sat to one side, dressed in navy. No jewelry. No makeup. Nothing but clarity in her voice and fire in her belly. Elijah sat behind her, not as an advocate, but as an anchor. Solid, present. A reminder that history had walked through darker doors and still refused to bow. Lane entered with a legal rep and a smirk so faint you might miss it, but Naomi didn't. She knew it well. It was the smirk of men who thought they'd be protected. Who thought the system was their mirror, not a window. Who believed scrutiny was for others and due process was a leash for the poor. The chairwoman, a woman of mixed descent with silver hair tucked beneath a no-nonsense bun, called the session to order. First came the reading of complaints. Dozens. Written testimonies from passengers. And from staff. One after another, stories were read into the record. How Lane made elderly passengers feel like thieves. How he randomly screened the same types of people, darker skin, foreign names, uncertain English. How his reports always seemed to forget context, but remembered suspicion. Lane's lawyer objected to the tone, objected to implication, objected to the emotional weight of the words. But Naomi leaned forward and said, quietly but with conviction, this isn't about implication. It's about accumulation. They asked Naomi to testify. She didn't speak as an accuser. She spoke as a witness. She described how Lane stood, always a little too close. How his voice shifted when he saw a black woman. How he searched things not to find contraband, but to find control. Then she read from her log. Dates. Times. Descriptions of passengers he pulled aside. 2 Indians, 1 Latina mother, a veteran in uniform, and a teen boy with tears in his eyes. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because the room was already listening. Lane was then asked to speak. He stood. He cleared his throat. And he blamed the procedure. He said he followed training. He said safety must come before feelings. He said, sometimes the people who cry racism are just trying to deflect. Elijah clenched his jaw but said nothing. It wasn't the first time he'd heard that line. It wouldn't be the last. But the chairwoman didn't blink. She asked Lane to explain why his random checks had so consistently targeted one demographic. Lane stammered. He referenced intuition. He referenced body language. You mean bias, the chairwoman replied. You mean your gut thinks some people are guilty until proven white. Gasps in the room. Lane's lawyer objected. The chairwoman overruled it. Then came the final blow, video footage. Compiled from multiple shifts. Ron Lane, again and again, waving through business travelers in khakis. Stopping brown grandmothers. Stopping teens with backpacks. Stopping dignity at the door. The footage didn't show violence. It showed something more insidious. A pattern. An erosion. An everyday act that, left unchecked, becomes a system. And after that, there was no more noise. Even Lane sat silent, his smirk gone, his eyes no longer scanning for control but looking, for the first time, a little bit afraid. The committee recessed. Naomi stepped outside, the late afternoon sun cutting shadows across the plaza like prison bars. She took a breath. Elijah joined her. He said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Whatever happens next, you told the truth." She nodded. "I didn't just tell it," she whispered. "I carried it, until they had no choice but to see it. And that, perhaps, is what justice is. Not a verdict, not a sentence. But the moment the lie breaks and the truth walks free, there is a silence that follows truth, not the hush of awe, but the pause of reckoning. A breath the nation holds when it realizes the mirror has not only cracked, it's been crooked all along." Naomi Clark stood at the window of her modest hotel room, staring out over Atlanta's glowing skyline. Somewhere beneath that glow, in some terminal corridor, men and women were still lining up, still handing over documents, still hoping to pass through without incident. And Lane was no longer among them. The committee's decision came down the next morning. The report was damning. The termination was immediate. The security firm's contract was suspended pending review. But justice, Naomi knew, was not a pink slip. Justice was the long walk back from a lie. It was facing what had been tolerated in silence for years, perhaps decades, and choosing not to look away this time. Later that week, Naomi was invited to a community forum hosted by the Airport Ethics Council. A modest gathering, retired teachers, Vietnam veterans, young flight attendants, and pastors who remembered when separate but equal meant you flew in the back of the plane if you flew at all. The moderator was a woman in her 70s with salt and pepper dreadlocks and a voice like gravel dipped in honey. She introduced Naomi simply. "This is the woman who made them listen." Naomi took the podium, not as a hero, not as a whistleblower, but as a witness to a deeper truth. "I didn't set out to bring a man down," she began, eyes scanning the room of weathered faces and watchful hearts. "I set out to hold a mirror to a system that gave that man the confidence to act the way he did for years without question." The elders nodded, not in surprise, but in recognition. She continued, "We've grown accustomed to the slow humiliations, the added searches, the sideways glances, the burden of explaining our presence in spaces we've already earned." A man in the front row murmured, "Yes, Lord," under his breath. Naomi paused, then said something that hung in the air like thunder behind closed doors. "The airport is just America in miniature. Same fears, same biases, same unspoken rules. Only faster, only louder, only with uniforms and the illusion of objectivity." She could see it on their faces. They didn't need her to explain what it felt like to be deemed suspicious before saying a word. To have your dignity processed like a bag of contraband. That night, a former TSA officer approached her quietly in the parking lot. White man, late 50s, eyes heavy with regret. "I worked with Lane," he said, his voice low. "Knew something was off. We all did. But nobody wanted to make waves." Naomi didn't scold him. She didn't even nod. She just asked, "And what will you do now that the water's stirred?" He swallowed. "I don't know. but I won't be silent again." Naomi offered a small, weary smile. That was all she needed. In the weeks that followed, the ripple became a tide. Airports in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Houston began internal reviews of their own security protocols. Passenger feedback forums were established. Bias training became mandatory, not as a box to check, but as a mirror to hold. Naomi wasn't naive. She knew real change moves like molasses through bureaucracy. But something had shifted. One morning, as she sat in a cafe in D.C. before her next assignment, she received a handwritten letter postmarked from a small town in Alabama. It read, _Ms. Clark. I saw what you did. I was one of the ones who got stopped years ago. My daughter still asks why we were pulled aside while others walked through. I didn't have the words then. Now I just tell her, because some people can't see us clearly. But one day, they will. Thank you for being the eyes they couldn't ignore. _. She folded the letter and tucked it into her notebook. Outside, a plane thundered overhead, another journey, another checkpoint, another chance to be seen or erased. But Naomi Clark was still watching, still walking the line between the overlooked and the overpoliced. And as long as people like Lane existed, so would she. Not just to call them out, but to remind this country of the truth it keeps trying to bury. That justice is not an airport slogan. It's the lived right to move freely through the world, without suspicion, without humiliation, and without having to prove that you belong.